Hi, it's Mark and welcome back to No Book Left Behind, and today I'll be discussing some Lost World literature, namely Warlords of Atlantis by Paul Victor and Land of Mystery by Edward S. Ellis. So we'll begin today with Warlords of Atlantis by Paul Victor. Now this is a novelisation of the 1978 movie starring Doug McClure, Peter Gilmore, Daniel Massey and Sid Charisse. It's based on an original screenplay by Brian Hales, who also provides a short introduction to the story. The story focuses on the adventures of English-born Charlie Aiken and his American best friend Greg Collinson, who originally meet in 1875 at a school in Boston. Now, Charlie's father is a world-famous marine biologist, and he follows in his father's footsteps, while Greg apprentices to his father's architecture firm, but on one condition: that he can spend at least some of his working week developing his ideas for a new diving bell, which he has been inspired to create by a childhood chat with Charlie's father about marine exploration. On the eve of the diving bell's first full test dive, Greg is contacted by a mysterious Frenchman who contracts the bell for use in a treasure hunt, and he offers so much money that Greg can't really turn it down. But when they get out to sea, Greg finds that he's been duped. There is no mysterious Frenchman, and the people in charge are actually Charlie and his father, the professor. During the previous year, the professor's professional reputation has taken a bit of a hit due to his theories about prehistoric sea life surviving until the modern day, and he wants to use Greg's diving bell to prove his theories are correct. But he wants to dive in the notoriously mysterious and dangerous seas of the Bermuda Triangle. On their first test dive, Greg and Charlie are attacked by a prehistoric sea creature thought to be extinct for millions of years, thus proving the professor's theories. But they also find a very large gold statue standing on a rock underwater, and this reveals the true purpose of Charlie and his father's quest, that is, to find a legendary island of Atlantis, which they believe has now sunk beneath the waves. Now, if you're only familiar with the movie, you'll likely not have recognised much of that story outline I just gave you, save for the last couple of lines. Now, whether all this early material was in Hales's screenplay to begin with, or whether it was an invention of Victor's in order to expand the novel and provide a bit more of a fully realised story, I don't know, but there's no denying that it's pretty effective, and it does encourage character investment. The early scene where the professor chats to Greg as a child is particularly effective in laying the groundwork for what happens later, and the expedition seems like just an inevitable outcome of the talk he gives him with regard to the mysteries of the sea and the possibilities of discovering a place like Atlantis. Also, it does elevate the professor's characters to being something a little more than a bystander, which is pretty much all he really is in the movie. You won't be surprised to learn that, of course, Victor's novelisation is mostly a straightforward telling of what you get to see on the big screen. But there are another couple of places where it differs markedly, and those are well worth noting. In the film, Greg and the ship's crew are placed in confinement by the Atlantean Guard, but they escape to go looking for Charlie, who's been taken to the upper city. Now, to do this, they travel through a drainage channel, and they emerge at the other end of their destination and find themselves in a corridor, which just happens to be right outside the room where Charlie is being entertained by the high officials of Atlantis, Atraxion and Atsil. How convenient. In the book, it's somewhat different. They travel through several of the other cities of Atlantis in order to get there and interact with some of the inhabitants. And the Atlanteans are presented in an almost dreamlike, hallucinatory way, as if they're not corporeal beings at all, but floating in some kind of in-between existence. And this is highly effective indeed, but likely was a bit difficult to realise on the big screen. Now, I think this was probably part of Hales's original concept for the story, because his original title was Seven Cities to Atlantis, and that would seem to suggest that there would be more to the story than just the heroes happening to pop up in the right place at the right time to rescue Charlie. And it does hint at a far more expansive tale, which was probably the one the writer wished to tell. Now, the other major change is during the escape sequence, where Greg and Delphine, daughter of one of the mariners kidnapped over the years by the Atlanteans, have to outfox the guards in order to aid their escape by obtaining some guns and ammunition. Sadly, it's not in the film, but it's a shame it's not, because it would provide Delphine with a reason for being in the story other than to be the girl and a glamorous kind of tour guide. To summarise, this is a surprisingly enjoyable addition to the Atlantis mythos. I particularly like Hales's concepts as to the Atlanteans' motivations and their long-term plan, and how it plays into real 20th century history. And the interesting thing is, when you reflect on the story afterwards, you realise that they kind of succeeded, and that the brief presence of our little band of adventurers did nothing to deflect their long-term goals. It's kind of a layer of commentary you don't really expect in something that you imagine was squarely aimed at the juvenile market. One interesting question, of course, is why Victor ended up doing the novelisation and why Hales did not do it himself. He was an author. He had written a couple of stand-alone books, and also some novelisations of the Doctor Who scripts that he'd written for John Pertwee's Third Doctor. Now, it may have simply been that he was too busy at the time, and the novelisation had to be out for May 1978 when the film was released. However, it's sad to report that Hales did actually pass away 6 months later in October, and although there's no real information about the whys and wherefores, it is possible that illness was impacting his ability to work. Although he did complete his last screenplay around autumn 1978 for the fantasy movie An Arabian Adventure, which was also directed by Kevin Connor, who directed Warlords of Atlantis, and starred Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing in a slight cameo role. Information on Victor is even scarcer. Goodreads does list some titles under that name from around that era, including an adaptation of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter and a novel called The Psychic, but these seem to have been aimed at readers learning English as a second language. There are also some titles from the 2010s, but given the dates, it's probable these were written by a different person. But whatever the case, Victor certainly did a bang-up job with Warlords of Atlantis. So let's move on to the second novel we're talking about today, The Land of Mystery by Edward S. Ellis, which was originally published in 1901 by Hearst and Company in the United States. Now, the story opens in a canoe travelling upriver through the Amazon jungle. It's manned by Fred Ashman, a 20-something adventurer, Professor Ernest Gruch, a German scientist, middle-aged New Englander Jared Long, and sailor Aaron Johnston, as well as 3 native servants. Ashman and Gruch are the leaders of the expedition, whose purpose is to discover a lost city deep in the jungle, supposedly laden with riches. They are travelling toward the Mato Grosso region through the rainforest, and at first the native tribes run from them. But after a while they begin trading with some of them, and as they move upriver they suddenly encounter the Merhapa tribe, who attack and kill Johnston, but the others manage to escape. Then Ashman encounters their war chief, Zifak, brother to King Hafgo. Ashman outwits him, then spares his life, and the two immediately strike up a somewhat unlikely friendship, which proves vital when the adventurers are betrayed. Now, this is a rather uninspiring jungle adventure that ticks a lot of the usual boxes for this kind of endeavour. There's survival in a hostile environment, heroic battles with savage tribesmen, romance with a native princess, a cave filled with fabulous diamonds, and a noble savage in the form of Zifak. Now this last trope, if you're not familiar with it, is of a native man who symbolises innate human goodness due to his fundamental connection with the natural world, uncorrupted by the influences of modern civilization. It was particularly popular in the Victorian era, probably due to the increased pace of social change and mechanization, but actually dates as far back as the Roman Empire, would you believe? But it was most popularized in Western culture by James Fenimore Cooper's novel The Last of the Mohicans, which was published in 1826. Despite his almost superhuman abilities, the noble savage always recognizes the worth of the white man, of course, and pledges his unshakable loyalty to him. In this particular case, this leads to Zifak betraying his people and causing numerous fatalities amongst their number. Through Ashman's dialogue, Ellis just does acknowledge that this is a bit hard to swallow, but he never explains it, and just acknowledging it isn't really enough to justify its existence in the story. Ellis's writing style is also a little bit laborious. Not difficult, not overly flowery, just laborious. He over-explains things that are obvious so much. For example, when Ashman and Johnson decide to leave their hiding place where they're watching a native ceremony in secret, he spends an entire paragraph explaining the reasons for it, and the entire following paragraph explaining the reasons why they need to be careful as they sneak away. It's all information that could have been conveyed in a couple of lines of whispered dialogue, and sadly that's his default position throughout the whole novel, and this does make for rather a plodding reading experience. As is often the case with these turn of the 20th century novels, we have to talk about depictions of race. Now, it's not as bad here as you might expect, although the three natives who accompany the white men on their voyage do spend a great deal of time cowering in fear at the bottom of the boat. However, their leader Bippo does conquer his fears in order to perform a heroic act. And there's no questioning Zifak's heroic credentials, of course. The native tribesmen are out to kill, but they're acting on the orders of King Hafgo, and you could argue quite reasonably that they are only seeking to defend their homeland against invaders. So it's not as regressive as you might think. However, that does come with rather a large caveat. You see, King Hafgo is fair-skinned and can pass for white. As before, Ellis acknowledges that this is a mystery, but he never explains it. And again, just acknowledging that it's a mystery doesn't make it credible. So why put it in the novel in the first place? Quite probably because convention dictates that handsome hero Ashman must fall in love with the native princess. And I'm guessing that mixed-race romance was still a touchy area in literature at that time. The likelihood of that is increased by the fact that Ellis takes almost every opportunity to mention the Princess Ariel's fair-skinned complexion. This compromise on race could have been dictated by Ellis's target audience. The book is not clearly aimed at juvenile readers, but most of his works did tend to be popular with that younger demographic. This was particularly true of his Deerfoot westerns, which were focused on the exploits of a young Shawnee brave. And this would also explain the somewhat pedantic, over-explanatory prose that I was complaining about a few minutes ago. Born in 1840, Ellis wrote over 200 books, most of which were dime novels, very inexpensive paperbacks which were incredibly popular during the mid and latter parts of the 19th century. Mostly he published under his own name, but he did use a few pseudonyms, including James Fenimore Cooper Adams, which may of course have been a tribute to his literary hero, but may also have been rather a naughty way to try and sell more books. Finally, one question remains. Is this really Lost World literature at all? When Ashman and company meet the Murapas, they've already encountered two white men, the dastardly Wagaman and Burkhart, and they're apparently convicts who have escaped from a nearby diamond mine, which apparently is just down the road. So is this really a lost world at all? Sounds more like it's just a little bit off the beaten track. Would I recommend this one? No, not really. It's bland, forgettable, and it lacks interesting and outlandish elements. If you want an old-fashioned adventure novel of this type, why not simply check out Last of the Mohicans? It's a far better time. So that's it for today's video on No Book Left Behind. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for sticking with me right the way until the end. Have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? Have you seen the movie of Warlords of Atlantis? Are there any other examples of Lost World literature you'd like me to cover on the channel? All suggestions are welcome, and please drop them in the comments below, or off to the side if you're watching this on an iPad and you've turned it sideways. Anyway, please like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. The YouTube algorithm appreciates it, and so do I. And in the meantime, please keep rooting through those second-hand bookstores in those obscure, narrow back streets of your city. Look through those bargain bins, because there are some treasures out there that only you can find. Cheers. But as they move upriver, they are actually attacked by an aggressive tribe called the Mufistas. Called the what? I can't remember what they're called.